Hi folks, Andy here with another breakdown of the latest episode of Vice's Dark Side of the Ring, this one on the life and tragic passing of Chris Kanyon, former WCW and WWE superstar. Now, this is a sad story and one we're going to get straight into, but before that, let me issue a brief trigger warning for suicide. With that in mind, I'm Andy for What Culture Wrestling, and here are 10 things we learned from Dark Side of the Ring, the double life of Chris Kanyon. Number 10, the background. So you know the drill with the first entry on these lists. It's information that you might know a little bit about already, but is pretty vital to understanding the other points we're going to talk about later on. So just fill you in on some of the details regarding Chris Kanyon. He was one of his era's great underutilized guys in WCW, WWE and beyond, regarded as an innovator between the ropes, and it's something that really gets hammered home as you listen to his peers and younger wrestlers talk about what he brought to the table in the ring. Now, away from the ring, he lived his life as a closeted homosexual. He felt that if he ever came out, if he ever expressed his true identity, the wrestling industry would punish him for it and his career would be ruined. And that really informed his tragic story. Concealing this became an obsession to Kanyon, who lived a life of increasingly erratic behavior until tragically he felt he had no other choice but to take his own life in 2010, having suffered an overdose on antidepressants. Let's go from there. Number 9, Chris Kanyon was loved. So this episode of Dark Side of the Ring features a lot of testimonials from not only Kanyon's peers, but some you'd consider his proteges in the wrestling business and his friends as well. DDP said that Kanyon was in the top 5% of people he ever worked with. He loved hitting the ring with the guy because he was so smooth, he was so easy to work with, easy to collaborate with. The Young Bucks, who are of a different generation of wrestler, but had personal interactions with Kanyon nonetheless, well, they spoke of his innovation, of how he brought the indie style to the mainstream and was one of the first guys to ever do that. And then you have Brian Cage, who trained under Kanyon and spoke of the great honor it was when later in his career Kanyon put Cage over on a small-scale indie show in his hometown. James Mitchell, or James Vandenberg in WCW, spoke with love in his voice, even when he was going over some of the more fractured moments between him and his old friend Chris Kanyon. So make no mistake, this is a guy who was very much loved, but ultimately haunted by having to conceal his own identity out of fear from what would happen if he ever came out. Number 8, he let off steam on his friends. The feelings within Chris Kanyon eventually manifested in outbursts aimed at his friend. Vandenberg has a bunch of different stories here of how these manifested, of Kanyon confronting him and choking him, squeezing his Adam's apple, of trashing his car after a road trip, of one particular story where Vandenberg felt compelled to pull a gun on the guy out of self-protection and said on video here that he was willing to pull the trigger. This is how hurt Kanyon had become by the whole situation. But as Vandenberg goes through them, there's an empathy to his voice. There's an empathy to the way he's telling these stories. And when you hear this next story, you go some way to understanding that why Kanyon felt he had to go to these lengths. Number 7, the Boy George incident. So this is the most unsavory on-screen moment, maybe of Kanyon's entire wrestling career. He returns to WWE after 18 months away through injury, and he is scripted in a segment with Paul Heyman to pop out of a box, sing "Do You Really Want to Hurt Me?" the Boy George Culture Club song, of course, at The Undertaker, and then get the hell beaten out of him. And it resulted in one of the most infamous and ugliest chair shots you will ever see in pro wrestling. A straight up, unprotected shot right to the dome. Undertaker really laid into him. It's a horrendous incident, a really tough one to revisit, and one that's not fully explored on the episode. But as we knew before, as we knew heading into this, it was one that Kanyon claimed at various points was punishment from the company for him being gay. And we get two conflicting accounts on this. The first one comes from Chris Jericho, who said there was no way WWE could have realistically not known about it. Somebody must have informed them, and the way it manifested, having never done anything on screen like this in his life, singing Boy George, there's no way that that could have happened without somebody knowing. But Raphael Morphy, who now works for AEW, said the opposite. He said there was no way that WWE was going to train Kanyon up for 18 months only to bring him back and bury him in such a nature. Like I said, it's not fully explored on the episode. It's, to be fair, probably quite hard to get a testimonial on something like this. So you just kind of have to listen to these stories and take it from there. Number 6, the lengths that Kanyon went to. So there are a number of different stories of the ways that Kanyon would try and hide his true sexuality from professional wrestling out of fear for what might happen. And one I want to talk about here is him completely manufacturing and making a heterosexual sex tape to convince the boys in professional wrestling that he was a heterosexual. Vandenberg was the guy assigned to help Kanyon make this, and he did. They found a girl, they found a hotel room, they wrote a script, they set the whole thing up, and then when they watched it back the next day, Kanyon and Vandenberg, well, it led to the gun incident that I described earlier in this video. It's a crazy story when you remove it from its context. If you walked up to somebody in the street and told them that, they probably wouldn't believe you, but these are the lengths that Kanyon felt he had to go to conceal who he really was. It's tragic listening to this because the world that Kanyon found himself in, wrestling, was so cold and unwelcoming to him that he felt he had to carry this with him for basically the rest of his life. Number 5, Kanyon became an unreliable narrator, and those are the words of James Vandenberg as he's telling the story of how, following the Boy George incident, he actually said to Vandenberg, "Oh no, that's not true. I'm saying that I felt that WWE were victimizing me for being gay as a cover story for if I ever had to sue them." And at that point, Vandenberg pointed out that for him personally, it became hard to tell what was the truth and what wasn't. Towards the end of his life, it's clear that Kanyon became a tortured soul, and even after coming out years later in 2006, it sadly wasn't enough. Number 4, the industry wouldn't work with him. There's one point in the video that's particularly poignant. It's the Young Bucks. They are speaking about their experiences with Kanyon throughout the whole thing. And they point out at one point that for the industry to work with Chris, it just became taboo. It became something they just didn't want to touch. And that was terrible for Kanyon, potentially even accelerating his downward spiral. And there's one story in particular that exemplifies this. Number 3, the Orlando Jordan situation. When Orlando Jordan was debuting on WWE television in the mid-2000s, there were reports circulating that WWE were going to present him as an openly gay character on their programming, and when Chris Kanyon heard this, in the words of the talking heads here, he felt that WWE and Jordan were, and I quote, stealing his gimmick. Vandenberg pointed out to Chris, well, that's something you can't put a patent on. You can't put a patent on sexuality. But Kanyon wrote to WWE, he wrote to Stephanie McMahon specifically and explained, I want to be the spokesperson for this. I want to help kids come out the way that I perhaps couldn't. Stephanie wrote a pithy response, a short response saying she was sorry to hear of the struggles Chris had faced, but she'd have to consult with WWE's legal department before getting back to him properly. And that was that. Kanyon never heard back from that point. The industry had ghosted him. A business that he had made a career of didn't want anything to do with him at the highest level. Number 2. This is one of the saddest stories that wrestling has ever seen. The Chris Kanyon story is one you've likely heard whispers about, or maybe you've dived into, maybe you're familiar with it from reading up testimonials and everything else about what happened at the time. But it's not really until you get an episode like this where you hear the people close to him telling these stories, reliving these stories and feeling these stories, that they really hammer home. On this episode, you're going to see people like Vandenberg, like DDP, like Luke Hawx tearing up as they tell these stories of things like Kanyon's anxiety really ratcheting up as he's working his Mortis character in WCW, or Just the horrifying phone call he made to a 19-year-old Matt Jackson for 45 minutes telling him he was going to end his own life. It's a rough road, and after reliving it, of course, the great hope has to be that Kanyon's story can maybe serve as an example to people so they don't have to tread that road themselves. And number one, a multifaceted legacy. These episodes of Dark Side of the Ring often close on something of a brighter note of whatever positives we can possibly glean from these horrendous, tragic situations, and this one is no different. It talks on the impact that Chris Kanyon has left behind, and it's not just as a performer, although we spend time with that. We see clips of guys like Brian Cage using his moves in the ring, showing the influence he had on these wrestlers, on some of the most prominent wrestlers in North America today, even though Kanyon himself was never the most prominently pushed guy on WCW television, WWE, or elsewhere. And that really speaks volumes. If you're essentially a mid-card guy, but you have this influence anyway, shows how underutilized you really were. But the most important point of all, and this is expressed by DDP, the Young Bucks, and Brian Cage, and pretty much everyone on the show, is that here in 2021, yes, there are always going to be regressive assholes standing stubbornly in the way of progress. But when you look around the modern wrestling scene and you see how many more LGBTQ+ wrestlers are out there and are able to feel like they can express their true identity compared to when Kanyon was in his prime and when he was going through these horrible feelings, that's a big step forward. Are things perfect? Have these problems suddenly gone away? Well, no, of course not. Like I said, there are always going to be assholes out there. And hopefully, as we continue to move forward, the awful, horrendous pressure that Chris Kanyon felt throughout his entire career merely for being himself continues to go away. Nobody should ever have to live through what he lived through. And while hate will always exist, while the assholes are always going to be out there, hopefully things are moving towards a better place. See you later.